Are you absolutely convinced, Aditya, this is state policy now that India will not take another terror attack lying down?
You know, in 2016, India brought in a paradigm shift in its policy. When the Uri terror attack happened and more than 19 of our soldiers were killed, in fact, I would say they were burned down, unfortunately, in a most barbaric terror attack in northern Kashmir. There was a response in the next few days with a surgical strike in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, legally Indian territory. And of course, launch pads were attacked. There were details about it, and of course, awards were given in to the majors and the army, officers that were involved with it. Immediately after this, we have several other terror attacks in the pipeline, from Pulwama, from Pathankot to Dina Nagar and others. And finally, we have the Pulwama terror attack in 2019, 14th Feb, in which more than 40 of our CRPF soldiers get killed. And immediately in the next few days, we have the Balakot airstrike by the Indian Air Force, another such paradigm shift in policy that was brought in. And India conveyed a very strong message, not just to Pakistan, but the entire globe, that every time Pakistan dares to provoke India, kill its soldiers, or plan and conspire such terror attack, this new India will not look the other way. There will be a response, and every time there will be an increased response. The parameter of that response will increase manyfold. After 26/11 as well, the Indian Army and the Special Forces had a plan. The intelligence agencies had a plan, both the IB and the RNAW. But at that time, just like the former NSA has mentioned in his book, the political masters here decided that they will not go ahead with bombing the Lashkar-e-Toiba headquarters in Pakistan. Today, I'm glad at least that there is a strong response, and that's how one needs to deal with terrorism. Of course, there are situations where negotiations have a way, dialogue is the way forward for a political solution in several scenarios, but you cannot have dialogue with terrorists. You simply cannot. And I'm glad that India has had a leading role globally in fighting terrorism, and there are several examples to quote in the last 2 decades.
And moving to the other border that we look at, China. I mean, we are looking at what, the 4th consecutive winter deployment along the line of actual control with China. 200,000 plus Indian soldiers deployed there. What do you make of the Xi-Biden summit, Aditya?
Again, between 2019 and 20, there was another paradigm shift in India's policy, and that was towards China. Our focus of our foreign policy or military was completely towards Pakistan in not just last 30 years, but I would say over 70 years. And it finally struck the government and the policymakers and the military as well that China was a bigger threat, and we had to have a policy. And I'm glad that perhaps now in the next few months, we'll have a national security policy as well, clearly indicating what our aims really are.
What our threat perception
challenges and threat perceptions. And I don't see any kind of permanent change in the relationship between India and China and US and China. Of course, these bilateral dialogues and multilateral forums from G20 to BRICS to ASEAN and others will continue, including the Shanghai meeting as well. But of course, there is an attempt by the Indian government to at least have a dialogue both at the military level, at the diplomatic level, and of course the boundary talks that have been underway for last many decades. But it doesn't seem like Beijing is really interested in.
Aditya, there's also been a very big shift in the way the Home Ministry perceives the boundary dispute. I think there's a big alignment now on the way the Home Ministry and the Defense Ministry, they're kind of aligned on the way China is perceived on the border. Because this border village development is part of the Home Ministry's ambit, and I think the funds are coming out of there.
Exactly. I think it was a year ago or so when this shift in policy really happened. As per that, in Uttarakhand, in the northeast particularly, there will be employment opportunities that will be given to the youth in the border villages so that there is no migration that really happens.
The entire village is being depopulated because of migration.
Absolutely. So I think it's a very important step. Again, this is a step that could have happened decades ago. At least a beginning could have been made somewhere. But der aay durust aaye, I mean, that's the kind of phrase that we will go with here. Because as I said, 2019 was the time when, we can actually say that there's a new China policy, not just when we talk about foreign policy.
Right.
I think our domestic policy towards China, our IT policy towards China, our military policy towards China had a paradigm shift. And that's how the border development plan is also underway. The Home Ministry is working aggressively to provide employment, to provide perks to the people who stay back in these villages. There's more development that has been brought in, road connectivity as well, that helps both the civilian population and the military as well.
Yeah, it's a holistic approach, I think, from both the Defense Ministry and the Home Ministry. And this is something that should have, like you said, should have been done decades ago, but der aaye, durust aaye. But you know, the other thing, Aditya, is the fact that the way the Chinese have been building up their infrastructure on their side of the border. I mean, this is again a point that I'd raised with the minister yesterday, that we were looking at a China in 1962 that didn't have the kind of border infrastructure, that was not a superpower, it was not an economic giant, that wasn't a nuclear armed state, that didn't have a relationship or an alliance with Pakistan. And today they are all of this. They are an economic giant, they are a military superpower, they've built the kind of infrastructure. We've never had a superpower on our doorstep in this sense. How do you think the government is going to look at it in the next 10-15 years? This constant pressure, you know, on the boundary with the Chinese staring down. They're clearly not in any mood to negotiate.
You know, firstly, just like you mentioned a few minutes ago, that the West is mostly doing the talking, but it's India who's walking the talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
India is facing the threats and India is challenging the threats.
Right.
India is dealing with this night and day at the border and in the capital as well, both in Beijing as well as in New Delhi, challenging the expansion thought process of the Chinese. On the other hand, I mean, while these threats continue, one would also say that in an autocracy or in a dictatorship, it's much more easier to not just line up troops, but to actually have their way immediately. Here we have a bureaucratic policy.
Yes.
We have red tapeism with the kind of delay that really happens. If there's an army commander in the north of the country who wants something, by the time it reaches the Home Ministry, through the Defense Ministry, and perhaps the Prime Minister's office, it takes many months.
There's red tape.
I think in the last few years, this has changed.
Right.
I think much more efficiency has been brought in. But again, we are few decades past that.
Right.
China started this years ago, and not just remote development that we are talking about. I think the finest of roads, the finest of construction, the finest of equipment, along with ration and as well as whatever they need, is being brought in towards the borders, which the Indian army can actually see on the other side, not just with binoculars, by their own eyes. So I think there's much more that needs to be done. I think basic stuff has been done. Policy changes have been done as well. The BRO is also doing a fine job with the road construction. But again, we have to look towards the next 30 years goal plan of how to make this construction, development, handy and uplift the opportunities for the civilians also in that area.
Right. 30 years, a long time, but with China, as President Biden says, you have to trust but verify.
News9 Plus. Download now.